Hello, and welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. She is the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute and the initiator of the International Peace Coalition. Today is June 18th, 2025. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I'll be your host. You can send your questions and comments to Helga via email at questions@schillerinstitute.org or post them on the chat page. Well, Helga, based on the events of the last week, the IPC has its work cut out for it. The Warhawks assembled at the G7 conference in Canada with little apparent success, but their intelligence and operations teams were active, sabotaging peace initiatives for Ukraine and for Iran. Meetings addressing both crises in Istanbul and Oman were canceled, and it's increasingly hard to know what President Trump is up to. At the G7, he criticized the group for expelling Russia. But when it comes to Israel's attack on Iran, there are indications the US may become involved in the war if it isn't already, with the Nimitz carrier strike group heading to the region and a troop buildup continuing. And Trump is now calling for an unconditional surrender by Iran. Our talk today is titled, Will we bring humanity back from the abyss? Given that we are facing a potentially tragic outcome, how do we pull mankind back from the abyss?
Well, I think it does require that normal citizens, average people start to, act like true state citizens. With other words, that the number of people who are trying to be reasonable has to increase, and people have to develop the civil courage, the courage to stand up and demand a peaceful solution to all of these conflicts, which is eminently possible. I mean, at the last IPC meeting on Friday, we had a very fruitful discussion and produced a press release afterwards, or a leaflet, where we took up the contribution of one of the participants in this dialogue, Mr. Badra Kumar, the editor of the Indian Punchline. That's a blog in India, which is very well read around the world. And Mr. Badra Kumar is a former diplomat, and he made a very productive suggestion, namely that in order to diffuse the situation around the so-called Iranian nuclear program, that a consortium should be found, and they would basically develop peaceful nuclear energy together, and that way, bind Iran into such a consortium of nations, and that would be the guarantee that no nuclear bomb is intended. Now, that proposal is in correspondence to something which President Putin had made before this whole thing went into the attack by the Israelis against Iran, namely that Russia would also basically help not only with ideas and concrete proposals, but actually by helping concretely by taking the part of the Iranian uranium which is enriched beyond the standard allowed by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and then basically help Iran to develop its enrichment for the civilian part of the nuclear program. Now, that proposal was reiterated, as far as I know, today, because fortunately, despite these horrendous statements which you mentioned on the side of Trump, nevertheless, there was again the fifth telephone discussion between Trump and Putin, and both of them characterized it as very productive and useful. And apparently, President Putin reiterated the proposal of Russia mediating in the process. So I think not all is lost yet, but we need a mobilization of the population. I mean, this could go completely wrong. We could end up in World War III in a few days if this thing escalates. So I think we need a definite increase in the peace movement, and we need definitely a change in policy. You know, the geopolitics has to stop, because, you know, the actual underlying principles of what's going on in respect to Iran, and that is also agreed by many experts, has very little to do with the nuclear program. That's just a pretext. The real reason is regime change. They want to replace, or some forces want to replace, the present Iranian government with a Western government. And the aim of it is very clear, because if you have a Western government in Iran right now, the next thing is NATO would be in the uttermost corners of the north, east, and west. And therefore, offensive weapon systems would be very close to the borders of China and Russia. And that would be one more step in the whole global NATO, you know, the idea that eventually, you know, you will get rid of the present governments of Russia and China, and the Fukuyama dream, which he mentioned after the end of the Cold War, that the whole world would be ruled by the model of the British Empire, the Western liberal system, would come true. That will never happen, because there is no way how you can implement that. You can try as many regime changes as you want. It will lead to World War III. So the sooner we recognize that and come to the conclusion that geopolitics is a mental disease, because it's not legitimate for one country or a group of countries to defend their interests against those of another group of countries by military means. We have to find the common aims of mankind and then reorder our affairs accordingly.
You're listening to Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and we can take your questions and comments, send them to schillerinstitute.org. Now, Helga, speaking of geopolitics, it seems there's growing recognition of at least one of the main partners of the so-called coalition of the willing that's already involved in kinetic warfare. The Russians are very focused on the British. There were exposés, for example, on Project Alchemy. Sir Richard Dearloffe of the famed Iraq weapons of mass destruction hoax is bragging that they're going to knock the Russians out of the Black Sea. But the Russian permanent representative to the UN, Ambassador Vasily Nebenzia, spoke of the evidence of the British sheltering Israeli bombers in Cyprus. So it seems clear that the Brits are deeply into the war. What about the CIA and the US?
Well, I think that what people generally call the deep state, that is what Ray McGovern calls the Mickey Med, the military-industrial complex plus Congress plus the media plus intelligence, that apparatus, which has been warned against by President Eisenhower as the military-industrial complex, which had to be watched out for. I think that has developed to be, you know, it has become like a monster. And that is what is allied with the British, based on the Anglo-American special relationship. And it is very clear that those Europeans now who are in the coalition of the willing are not a colony of America. They are a colony of that particular deep state, or that, you know, that Mitti-Mek apparatus. So I think that is the structure which causes all the problems. And these are the people who are into, you know, deregulation of the markets. There are people who, you know, think that there's model of profit generation, maximization of profit, can be defended by all possible means. And, you know, I think we have entered a rogue form of government. And the more you look at it, it is that system which has become the monster John Quincy Adams warned against, you know, except the monster is not in foreign countries. The monster has taken over much of the institutions of the West.
Now, I have a question from a journalist in Germany who wrote that Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov today warned Washington against getting militarily involved in the Iran war. And he said, given the erratic nature of what's coming from Trump and other American officials, such as Rubio or Lindsey Graham, how dangerous is it when the trust built up between Trump and the Russians since his return to the White House is lost? And you mentioned there was another phone call today. So is it possible to keep that trust when there's such erratic policies coming from Washington?
Well, I think the loss of trust is enormous. I think Trump is really hanging out there by a thread because his own base, the MAGA base, is revolting. The support of Trump domestically in the United States is split. The neocons are happy about, bringing the apocalypse on in the Middle East because they are, basically think that they are the chosen tribe which will profit from all of that. But the majority of people who voted for Trump, the MAGA base, they are getting really frustrated, and some of them are even talking about betrayal. Now, for the rest of the world, I mean, what are people supposed to think? Trump is pretending that he is supporting the diplomatic process between Iran and the United States and basically the Oman discussions. And then at the same time, he is condoning or even supporting the Israeli attack on Iran. I think the West is in danger of losing all the trust of the majority of the world population because already the condoning of what all the UN courts, the ICJ and the ICC, have long called genocide in Gaza, the West was condoning it. In Germany, only in the very few last days is the reporting in the media shifting, basically, admitting the atrocities going on there, but that's late. And, the porcelain has been broken already. And, Trump, who started with a lot of support from many, many people around the world who were thinking that, if Trump can get peace with the largest, most powerful nuclear power in the world, Russia, then, that is the basis to start solving all other problems. Now, I think people are really getting very, very frustrated and think that Trump is not to be trusted because he says one thing one moment and the other thing in the next moment. And for example, that he started to criticize Tulsi Gabbard. All the peace-loving people in the world looked at the cabinet appointments of Trump, where people said that there are some people who really are the hope that this hornet's nest will be cleaned out. Tulsi Gabbard is definitely one of them. And if Trump starts to turn against her, I think the credit people gave Trump is running out thin. So one can only hope that the more reasonable people in his environment straighten him out on that point.
Well, speaking of that, we have a question sent in by a Make America Great Again Trump activist who writes that she's getting very frustrated, but she's wondering, is the disagreement that they're reporting between Director of National Intelligence Gabbard and Trump on the question of nuclear weapons, is that real or is that possibly a media creation?
You can ask me a lighter question. In this world, it's almost impossible. I tend to think that it is real because, Tulsi Gabbard did something which I think needs the highest respect. She made a video, I think 3 minute or so, short video, where she reported about her recent visit to Hiroshima and then in the strongest possible terms warned what will happen if the United States would be drawn into a nuclear war, that most people have no inkling how devastating the effect is of thermonuclear weapons. And, she did that obviously in the context of a warning how close we are to the use of such weapons. So that tells me, I also don't know if Trump knew that she would put this out. I think recently she has started to characterize her own statements as her personal statements and not as those in her capacity as the director of national intelligence. So that tends to, point in the direction that she is making a certain amount of effort, to get across to Trump and especially to the American people, not in line with the majority of what is coming from the Trump cabinet right now. So I tend to think that that this rift is real.
Now we have a question that comes from a retired banker who's now living in Costa Rica. And he said he's trying to follow the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, which opened today in Russia with thousands of guests. And he writes that he finds it ironic that while the governments of the collective West are busting their budgets to build up for war, Russia, China, and the global South are mapping plans for developing innovative technologies and that will add real wealth to their countries. Then he says, it seems that we in the West have no sense of history or economics. Is there an easy way to provide a crash course to policymakers?
Well, I think they should look at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum because there are 170 nations represented. That's a little bit less than 20, 25 are not there against 170. So is Russia isolated? Probably not. It's a gigantic event. They have 150 events and then a whole bunch of other fora on top of it. They have many topics. It's very far-reaching and broad in scope. So I think that the majority of the momentum is with the global South, the global majority, the BRICS countries. And, we have been saying for quite some time now, the easiest way, and really easiest way, to stop all the problems would be that the countries in the West would say, well, maybe we should correct our policies, we should stop this geopolitics, and we offer to them to cooperate. And I'm 100% certain the response from the BRICS countries and all the other institutions which are forming new and growing would be open arms and welcoming the countries of the West, because Brazil, Indonesia, China, Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, all of these countries, they do not want hegemony in the world. They want to have a new system based on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. They want to, overcome poverty, underdevelopment. They want to create middle-level income conditions in all of their countries, and they would welcome the cooperation. And if the human species is not capable, at least in its leading institutions, to recognize that we have been on the wrong track, and then say, okay, we made a mistake, we readjust, we go back to the policies of dialogue, of diplomacy, of Helmut Schmidt, of Kennedy, of de Gaulle, there were so many politicians in the post-war period who had a completely different outlook, also in respect to the Soviet Union in the time of the Cold War. So, the idea that you have to have enemies like demonize Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, that's just completely wrong and the certain path to self-annihilation. So we need more people to just say, no, let's change course. They are doing something right, and we have to somehow recognize that this whole idea of the post 9/11 period, just to start somewhere, where the interventionist war started, where which were all based on lies, as we now know. The Iraq War 2003 was based on lies. The story around Ukraine, was completely different. We have not forgotten the Maidan coup and the words of Victoria Nuland, having spent $5 billion on NGOs in Ukraine alone to prepare the Maidan. Look, we are not idiots. Some of us have been following history on a day-to-day basis, and the effort to now control the narrative retrospectively, it may function for some people, but it doesn't function for everybody. So give it up.
Well, on this question of a crash course, I would say to my friend in Costa Rica that you basically are doing that every week with the International Peace Coalition Conference, and he can join the calls there where you have very prominent individuals joining you to discuss this. Also, we have an international conference coming up in Berlin, July 12th and 13th. So this is an opportunity for people to come to a live conference and participate in this kind of crash course. But it only works if you go out and take these ideas out to others. Now, I have an email from a contact who says she has 30 years experience working for mainstream media. And she said she's hoping that the growth of influence of the internet, podcasts, and social media could be better used to build a peace movement. She said, I hear Harley, Helga, Diane, Dennis Speed, and others all the time, but the total reach is still small compared to what it should be. Is there some way to form a coalition of alternate media to coordinate activities to increase the influence?
That is obviously an idea whose time has come. And I actually think that that's exactly what needs to be done. If all of these alternative media would basically say, for the common cause, we overcome our egos and our individual pride, and we work together, we would be the majority already. So I can only support your idea. You should get in contact with us and help, because you can help building exactly that. So I'm waiting for your call.
Now, here's a question from an economic analyst who asked if you would comment on the Genius Act. And what he said is that not long ago, Trump warned that the BRICS must not move against the dollar. Now it seems that his allies with the crypto summit and the push from speculators for Coinbase and other digital strategies, that they're the ones who are threatening the dollar. Can you comment?
Well, it's actually really a lesson in economics. People should somehow make sure gets in the vicinity of President Trump, because as you correctly said, he said he would wage war against any country which wants to de-dollarize. And then he allows this crypto, Bitcoin, stablecoin gang, because that is the sure way to de-dollarization. And that is actually a new bubble which will ruin the dollar. So I absolutely agree that, but I think Trump probably doesn't realize that. And somebody has to point it out to him.
Well, I think you just did. But we have to make sure someone else does. Now, one question that came in from the chat room from John says, it seems to me that there are two countries who are acting well outside of international norms, Israel and the United States. Some say they are the same thing. What is the actual relationship between Israel and the United States?
Well, I think that my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, whenever people would bring up the question of the Zionist lobby controlling the United States politics to a very large extent, he would actually say, no, look at it the other way around, that Israel has been used as a hand grenade by the Anglo-Americans to be thrown into any conflict which they want to, detonate. And if you look at, in particular, for example, the role of the British right now in steering the Israeli attack on Iran, on the specific role of Sarah Dearlove, former head of the MI6, or what Keir Starmer is basically saying, instigating. He admitted practically that he has ordered much of the British Air Force and other parts of the army to be deployed into the region, like the United States has now been doing. I think that the relationship is more, like it's a tool. It does not mean that Israel has their own, sometimes very difficult to understand religious constructs about how they think the world should function. And there are some Christian fundamentalists in the United States who share these particular beliefs, which I think, the idea that Armageddon can be a good thing because it favors some people. I mean, it's very difficult to understand if you are not part of this belief. But I think the relationship is one which has really hurt the United States probably more than anything else, because if you look at the loss of credibility with, condoning what is happening in Gaza and now condoning what is clearly an unprovoked act of aggression by Israel against Iran. I mean, look, you have to always think that the countries of the global majority have their own experience with colonialism. They know who these players are. And when they see this kind of behavior, I think that this may be the downfall of, the whole West. If we don't shape up, I believe that the moral damage which has been done to itself by the Western countries may be the beginning of the end of this empire.
Well, Helga, we have one further question from Steve, who picked up on what you said about the possibility, if there's a regime change in Iran, that NATO would be able to move into the area and take it over. He says it looks to him as though the regime change against Iran is part of an action against the Belt and Road Initiative and the BRICS. And he wanted you to comment on that.
It is for sure that, because Iran has become a full member of the BRICS, it's part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And if you look at the geographic position, Iran is in the middle. It's in the middle of the East-West Silk Road connection between China and Europe. It's in the middle of the North-South corridor from Russia to India. And, if there would be a Western regime and NATO would be infested inside Iran, it would be part of the prelude to World War III. Now, that is not a new phenomenon. I mean, some alternative media have started to circulate this report by the Brookings Institute, which was published first in 2009. The title of it is something like U.S. Policy towards Iran. It's a longer title than that. And it is an extremely important document. It's 170 pages, and it has the entire chronology. If you look at what happened between the West and Iran since 2009, you can see that the US-British policy is following this Brookings report like a script. For example, it says, one should first create an international nuclear deal to, basically control the nuclear peaceful production of Iran. That was done under Obama with the GPCOA treaty. Then the next chapter says, in the Brookings report, then it should be unilaterally cancelled. That was done by Trump. And then the next chapter says, and then this should be taken as a pretext for attacks against Iran. That's what the scenario is, what is happening now. And likewise, many other aspects. So, that points to the fact that what is happening right now is that the policy is the long-term policy of the dominant power, the United States as a dominant power in the world, unilateral control. This is what Vice Admiral, I think was his position, Buchanan, said at this unbelievable conference of the CSIS last November. This was towards the end of the Biden administration, where Buchanan made this unbelievable speech where he said, yes, we consider the use of a tactical nuclear war an option. We just have to pay attention to the fact that the United States keeps its dominant position afterwards to have new tactical warfares and always keeps the dominant position in the world. This was not refuted by Biden nor anybody else of rank. And that is obviously part of the long-term thinking, like this idea of regime change against any country which is not submitting to the unipolar world order. And I think that that is really what has to change, which is why, we want to uphold the tradition of the American Revolution. Next year, there will be the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. The Americans should remember that they fought the first anti-colonial war against the British Empire. And by remembering that, they find the perfect basis for the dialogue with the global South, who are also involved in the same anti-colonial struggle, like the young American Republic. And America should go back to the foreign policy of John Quincy Adams and his famous speech of 1821, where he said, it's not the purpose of the United States to go abroad and fight foreign monsters, but to work peacefully with a partnership with other countries for everybody's common good. So that is what we have to move the United States towards. And that was the impulse of Trump. That's why the MAGA people voted for him. But he is now in great danger of losing their support if he does not go back to this policy.
Well, for those of you who want to participate in this kind of crash course, make sure that you forward this or share this video today and every week. And also join us on Friday. Helga, what's up for the International Peace Coalition this Friday?
Well, obviously the crisis in the Middle East, hopefully it will, go in the direction of diplomacy again. There are reports that there were 3 Iranian airplanes today seen on the flight to Oman. Hopefully this was where diplomats were going back to the negotiation table. I have no guarantee of it, but the fact that Putin and Trump telephoned today would give a certain hope. We are not out of the danger zone one bit, because obviously, Israel basically said that they will not basically submit to any conditions like that. I think we will have Ray McGovern, we will have other experts from the Middle East. And so the IPC is the must place for anybody who wants to have every week the judgment and expertise of people who are really speaking the truth, who have developed through their life work an insight which you never will get from the mainstream media, at least not these days. So if you want to be top informed and even be part of a movement trying to stop what could be the end of civilization, namely World War III, then every week join and bring your neighbors and colleagues with you, and let's make the IPC grow until we are the dominant force in this whole matter.
Well, Helga, thank you for joining us again today, and I'll see you on this Friday.
Yes, till Friday.